Please be seated. We hear in the gospel message this morning of a young man who, like so many others that we hear in the gospel stories, was longing, felt empty, went to Jesus, and we even hear that he went and knelt on his knees, which we could imagine would be a real posture of wanting healing and asking for help. We hear the words, "You lack one thing." Wow. What would it be like to hear Jesus say, you lack one thing? And the young man, with all of his earnestness and my imagination, he just felt like his heart was open and he just was coming to Jesus. What could I lack? I've been doing it all right. I bet many of us know that feeling, don't we? We hear Jesus go through the commandments. You shouldn't murder, you shouldn't commit adultery, you shouldn't steal, all good things. But my guess is each one of us on a given day could look through the commandments and say, you know what, I've been doing this my whole life. I still feel empty or lost this day. I've done it right. So often when this gospel is preached, its focus is on money, which is important, and I will talk about that. I don't want to not talk about that. But I also want us to name that we hear this young man, he said, I've been practicing my faith since I was a young person. And yet I still feel empty. Something's missing. And we hear Jesus say to him those words that I can imagine, at least for me in the midst of prayer, would be so hard to hear. You lack one thing. Oh my God, I already think I lack a million things. What does Jesus think I'm lacking? Just sell everything you have. Sell everything you have and give it to the poor, and then follow me. And we hear that the young man wasn't ready. We hear his grief. We imagine him just, his head goes down. Perhaps he gets up off his knees and he walks away. So often when we hear this gospel story, that's where it ends. We're like, well, he didn't want to sell his stuff, so he leaves. Well, okay, that's important. But have you always turned on a dime when God wanted you to do something? Has God been nudging you ever? Have you ever felt like God was nudging you in a direction and you just weren't perhaps ready? I would offer up the idea that perhaps the young man wasn't ready. What might that have meant? He'd spent his whole life. He feels like he'd spent his whole life living a good life, trying to be faithful, and yet still felt longing. Our journey with God, our life in faith is such it can be so, what's a word I want to, it's hard to contain. Sometimes it's hard for words to contain them because it's not an easy path. It doesn't make sense, right? If you go for a job, you know what the deal is. You know what the hierarchy is. You know how you're supposed to do it. You know what success would look like. But a life of faith is different for all of us because we're all created differently. We all have different things in our lives that get in our way. Talks in this gospel about this rich young man, but there may be those among us that are not at all rich maybe feel very wanting and feel exactly the same way this young man does. Perhaps something in our life continues to get in our way. Perhaps we still hold on to something that causes us pain and separation. Many of us read a book last year by Reverend Stephen Charleston, and he talked about what a vision quest in the Indigenous community, what that's like. And he talked about it in terms of it being a process. He said, first of all, people come together and they make preparations. I don't think confirmation would be exactly the same thing, but let's be aware of trying to inform, prepare, know what is going to happen when you need to go out into the world and see who you are in right relationship with your Lord. Prepare. The next part is community. How important it is to be able to sit in community. To be able to sit in community and share your story. This young man would share his story. And yet I still feel empty, he says. And so part of this preparation is sharing his story with his elders. One of the things that's part of their tradition is if you've broken the law, you go and you have to sit with the people instead of needing to be put away. But that's another story. Nothing's perfect. But let's talk about being in community and then challenge. You know, we've all seen those movies about going off into the wilderness for 3 days. All by yourself. Not with any of the stuff. I don't know about you. What is the stuff you'd have to leave behind? You know, I'd have to leave behind my coffee. I'd have to leave behind my pillow that makes my neck not hurt. I'd have to leave behind my little car. I'd have to leave behind my favorite shoes. I couldn't pick all the choices, right? What would I have to leave behind? I'd have to leave behind being a priest because God doesn't care about all of this. Leave behind all the outside stuff that makes us feel like we know who we are. And just go out in the world and have to be with God. And then lament. Because we all have that place. We all have that place in our soul, that old saying is the longest journey in the world is the one from our head to our heart. Right? One of the reasons that this process is done in community is because there's this belief that when we come back from this experience, we will then be better members of community. We will have empathy for each other. We will know God. We will know ourselves. We'll be better members of community. Jesus was all about community. How is it that being a disciple of Jesus makes us better members of community? These last 3 weeks have all been teachings from Jesus about how to be better members of community. Usually doesn't come by stuff. I would suggest that Jesus isn't telling you to sell all your stuff, although I'm sure you would find some lament. My wondering is what Jesus is saying is all those things outside of ourselves. That's not what makes us who we are. That's not going to lead us to God. The young man wasn't quite ready. We hear Jesus say, you're lacking one thing, but we don't hear Jesus tell him what he lacks. We don't hear Jesus tell him what he lacks, so how do we figure out what we lack? If we go back to our Christian tradition and we hear the words of Thomas Merton, which are the same theme, my Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not necessarily mean that I'm actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always. Though I may seem to be lost in the shadow of death, I will not fear, for you are ever with me. You will never leave me to face my perils alone. We hear the Christian monk say to us, there are going to be times when I am going to be afraid, but I know that you're with me. So we hear Thomas Merton calling us to be courageous when we feel like we are longing or lost or you're lacking something. Even Thomas Merton says, I don't know where I'm going, but I know you're with me. We hear Thomas Merton being vulnerable. We hear him say, I may look like I'm lost. I may look like I'm lost, but I know that you are my beacon. Because sometimes we feel lost. We hear Thomas Merton talking about companionship and not doing this journey alone. We hear him talk about knowing that God is always with him and will lead him through. We hear in the gospel this message this morning of this young man who says he's practiced his faith all his life and he still feels lost. We hear Jesus saying, you lack one thing. Leave us this morning with the idea for us to pray about what it is we feel like we're lacking. And maybe what is it that we put in the place? What is we think, well, if I order the right sneakers, then I'll feel whole. If I had the right weight, I would feel whole. Darn it, God, if I just did this right, I'd feel whole. And maybe Jesus is saying, leave all those shoulds behind. And what would it be like to maybe go out and be there for someone else? In 12-step programs, we say, get outside yourself. Interrupt all that yucky thinking and go help somebody. Maybe when you least expect it, you will see Jesus. Maybe when you least expect it, whether it be in stranger or friend, you will not feel lacking in that moment or in that afternoon. And lastly, I would leave you with this thought that Reverend Charleston talked about, and the quote is, the quest, therefore, is reverse of intentionally placing ourselves in harm's way. It isn't about going out and being in harm's way so that we can get hurt and feel punished and, oh no, and lament. It is an act of placing ourselves in grace's way. How is it that you in your life this day, especially if you feel a bit lacking or empty or you feel that longing, may your lament lead you to placing yourself in Grace's way. It's hard for me to say my mother's name was Grace. That's a long story and a book. But God's grace is there for us in times when we least expect it. So on this day, May we wonder how it is that we, if we are feeling lacking, what Jesus is calling us to do is to follow Jesus and put ourselves in grace's way. What might that mean for you in your afternoon?